Hello everybody, my name is Evan and welcome back to the Big Brainers COVID-19 series. Today we will look into the social effects of COVID-19 on school and the overall learning of students during the school year. Included in this video are two interviews from current high school teachers, Mrs. Jean Ciala and Mr. Jared Neff. Compared to a normal year, how has the COVID-19 pandemic really impacted interactions between students and teachers, but also between teachers and teachers?
That's a great question, especially the between teachers and teachers part, something I actually haven't even thought of before. I will say, and I think most teachers would give you this answer, and I think there's definitely truth to it. We fear a lot of, this year, what impact will this year have on just social interaction, right? Like for me personally, one of my favorite things still about teaching, and I've been doing it for, let's just say over 10 years, is you get to a certain part of the year, like the first month of the school year is always, nobody really knows each other. There's a little bit of anxiety on all parts. But once things start to get into a flow, it just feels like you have a whole community that you build in the classroom. And I've always been fortunate to have that in most of my classes. And I just feel, honestly, this year in most of my classes, not all, but most, there's just a disconnect. And that's nobody's fault. I don't think it's the fault of the students for sure, but you just don't feel that connection with what you're doing and the kids with each other, and I think that's unfortunate. I think a lot of teachers would agree with me there. As far as teacher to teacher, because you'd asked, well, for one thing, teachers are human beings too. So we interact in the workplace and we're professionals there, but a lot of us are also friends outside of the workplace. And this year for us, just as with everybody else in our country and really the world at this point, is we really don't get to see each other much outside of work. So that's a little bit different this year too. Everything is work, and that's not always a healthy thing either. So I would say those are two differences.
Okay. So what types of technology has been introduced into this year that teachers are implementing into their curriculums? And in your opinion, how has that really impacted learning as a whole?
So we've obviously had to be able to, we've always had a digital learning management system. So we've always had Schoology, for example. So most teachers had, over the past few years, really just implemented Schoology. So, for example, I had done a lot with Schoology before the pandemic hit. So when that happened, it was not new to me, which I'm grateful for. However, the way that Schoology interacts with other platforms like an Edpuzzle or I'm trying to think of a variety of other just different ways that we used to use Schoology becomes very different. Nearpod, for example. I don't use Nearpod for PL2W, but I do use it a lot for my biology classes. And Nearpod is very different this year than it has been in the past. So there's a lot of it depends on where you were before the pandemic hit. And I think I was pretty much had adopted Schoology so that when the pandemic hit, it wasn't a big deal. The technology, obviously, of having this type of a meeting or a class by way of Zoom, I'd never heard of Zoom before, but we just dove right in and used it in the spring. Pretty user-friendly. You're using it now. It's pretty user-friendly. And so felt like I had that kind of under my belt. And like, okay, I know how to do Zoom now. And now we're switching to Google Meet, which is fine, but it's another new thing to learn. And my mentality is always like, well, I'll try it and see how it goes. And if it works, great. If it doesn't, we'll do something else. So not every teacher has that mentality. A lot of teachers get frustrated, and I've gotten frustrated as well when something doesn't work the way it's supposed to work. But the other piece of the technology, specifically with PLTW, is using some of their pre-designed, which I'm grateful for, pre-designed curricula like the biodigital model, where students are not creating a physical model as they would have last year, but it's a digital model. So that's one example where students are using something that I've never seen or used before. So I need to be familiar with it before I assign it or talk about it in a class. So everything that's new in the PLTW curriculum is something that the teachers need to see and understand and be able to use and teach before students see it. So there's always something new. And I'm very grateful that PLTW has done such a nice job in creating a lot of digital content. But that's something that is my responsibility then to learn before I teach it. So there's been a lot, and it depends on where you are in terms of your mindset, whether or not you're going to just try something or not. And it also would have depended on where you were in your comfort level with Schoology before the pandemic hit, and I felt pretty comfortable with it. So there's definitely a lot of new technology, but there's a continuum of where you might fall in terms of where your comfort was before the pandemic hit. Were you starting totally from scratch, or were you like, all right, I understand how to use technology? So depends on the teacher, but for me, I felt comfortable before the pandemic hit with Schoology. It's just that there have been some tweaking along the way. And of course, the entire PLTW curriculum is different from last year. So that's tough.
In your opinion, how do you feel about the fully online and remote learning that many students across this nation and across the world have had to go through? And do you see any foreseeable long-term effects with this style of learning?
Yeah, so I think I already spoke to some of my concerns there. What are the repercussions socially, just as far as communication? What are the repercussions of that? But I do want to speak to the potential positives that I think for some students who can excel independently, and maybe for students who are involved in a lot of other things beyond school, whether it's sports, like travel teams and things like that, once that's a thing again, whether it's just like independent studies and tutoring and things like that. I do think that like an online format gives them an opportunity to get all of their school stuff out of the way so that they can also pursue those other things, music. So I do think for a kid who's motivated, it can free up time that would otherwise be spent in some cases sitting in a study hall, or just even moving from class to class, traveling to school. So I do think there are some positives there, but I think the negative repercussions we shall see, but that social component is the part that concerns me the most.
So you mentioned before about how you teach human body systems, which is the second level course in the PLTW curriculum. And that is a very interactive course, as you said before. So, and then I know you mentioned about how you've transitioned to using online labs and the curriculum that PLTW has provided for this online learning. But could you please go into a little bit more detail of how, especially for STEM classes like science classes, how this online learning, how it's impacted the interactiveness of them?
Yeah, it's when a student signs up for a course like any of the PLTW courses, it doesn't even have to be biomed, it can be the computer science, or it can be the engineering program. Students who sign up for this course are hoping for interactive experiences. Students who sign up for PLTW pathway are looking for non-traditional ways to learn the content, to push them to another level, and also connect with other courses. So it hurts my heart for those kids, which is everybody sitting in front of me, be it on a Google Meet or in classroom, knowing that they didn't sign up for the class that they're getting. And it's nobody's fault. So we have changed from the beginning of the year until now as the cases in our local community have increased. So the beginning of the year, we had microscopes out, and certainly we, cleaned them, and I was constantly, washing them down with alcohol, and slides were shared, and I was constantly washing them down with, alcohol pads, and any equipment that we use got UV irradiated. So obviously that's all new from last year, but actually some of it's not bad practice just in general. But we've now gotten to the point where, with the local cases really getting to a point where it's a concern, Mrs. Kowalski and I, my colleague, have said, I just don't even want the kids near each other. It is that big of a concern. So you've probably noticed we've done less and less of that kind of interactive, even minor assignment, like looking on a microscope. So it's definitely evolved to a point now where there's really not a lot of hands-on interactive labs. And I feel terribly for you and for all the kids who have signed up for this class thinking that you were going to be able to, perform these dissections on your own, which we did have a chance to do, but we were very, very, cautious about who was near who and what kind of equipment we could use and share. For example, there was a lab that we just did, right? It was between Thanksgiving and Christmas, where it's a cool lab where you guys, would be hooked up to an EKG and you're testing your reflexes. And Mrs. Kowalski and I spent weeks just, how can we do this where it's safe for the kids? And we couldn't come up with a way to make it safe. So, because you would be near one another, hitting your patellar, looking at your patellar reflex, checking out the EKG, you would be too close to one another. So we just said, well, we're just going to have to make this virtual, which is painful. Every single time you have to come to that conclusion of, well, we've really racked our brains as to how we can make this more interactive, and we can't. So we're just going to have to make this virtual. And like I said, virtual labs every once in a while. There are labs that I think I will use in Honors Bio and CP Bio next year because I think they're neat. But to have a lab every single week be virtual, it's taxing on students because they're tired of looking at their computer. I'm tired of looking at my computer. So when PLTW students come into my room and, they're hoping for an interactive experience. And I'm like, okay, let's open up PLTW and you work on your computer for the next hour. Like nobody wants that. So it's frustrating. And Mrs. Kowalski and myself and all of the other PLTW teachers are involved in communities, online communities by way of PLTW, by way of Facebook, by way of YouTube, communities of other PLTW teachers to see how are other teachers doing this and can we use some of that? So we're constantly striving to make it less dry and less virtual, but right now where our community is in terms of the cases, we've got to keep kids away from one another. So it's frustrating and it affects everything, absolutely everything.
As a teacher, so there's going to be activities that you would do in a normal year with a class when there's no need for social distancing. However, due to the online nature of this year, how have the activities that you've been able to do impacted really? And how have they been adapted to either online or completely scrapped?
Yeah, great question. So, for one, I'm always my own worst critic. So I never feel 100% happy with how a year goes. It's not to say I don't, I think there are successes, but I always try to learn from what could we have done differently. And the number one thing that I feel like I'm lacking in my classroom, which would be your classroom at this point, that I always love doing is just the discussion. And I'm talking, more formally like Socratic discussion, so the more open-ended student-led discussions on a topic that might be related to something we're reading or even social issues at this point. Those to me, they're so dynamic and they force that critical thinking that I think is maybe the most important thing we do in an English class. And I really just feel I've been struggling with how to do those, because to do them well, you first kind of have to establish a trust from student to student and student to teacher, right? So we have to create that community first before we're all going to be willing and able to share our opinions and to engage with each other and to debate with each other in a way that's where we know we're not fighting, we're not arguing, we're just simply we're pushing back and forth, a real actual intellectual discussion. That's something I pride myself on being able to manage pretty well in a normal year. And I think we barely scratched the surface of that this year. So it is actually something you, for better or worse, you're going to see we're going to be trying to do more of. But that's been a personal struggle for me this year, is how to get that to happen without forcing it. So that would be the major thing, in my opinion.